Let's turn to how the demand for goods today gets determined. Once we have this, then we can pull everything together. Remember that total demand in this economy is composed of three parts. First, we have what consumers are demanding. Second, we have what firms are demanding. And third, we have what the government is demanding. So the total quantity of goods today ends up getting split among these three different agents: consumers, firms, and the government. This is an economy where there's no foreign sector, so we don't have to worry about whether we can get any goods from overseas or whether anybody overseas is buying our goods. So everything here stays within the model, stays within the economy. Now, consumption and investment demand, as we know already, depends on the real interest rate. And therefore, the total demand for goods also depends on the real interest rate. We're just treating government purchases as exogenous, so they're not influenced by the real interest rate. So what we want to do is try to link the demand for goods today to income today. Well, higher current income is going to raise consumers' wealth. Higher wealth is going to increase consumption demand today for any given interest rate. On the other hand, the firm's demand for investment and the government's demand for goods do not depend on wealth. And so therefore, what we have is that variations in income today will affect consumption demand today, but will not affect investment or government demand. Now we're turning to a different kind of graph. What we have down here is current income, and what we have up here is the demand for goods today. Okay, now what is point A? Well, point A is on this curve, which is the consumption demand plus investment demand plus government spending. And it lies along this 45-degree line. So that is going to be a point where current income today, Y1, is just enough to generate the demand, YD1. So we can think about that points along the 45-degree line as being points where Y1 income generates YD1 level of demand. One thing to note is that what we have down here, this horizontal green line, is investment plus government spending. Those things, by assumption, don't depend on wealth, and therefore they're independent of current income. So what we have in this blue line is we have consumption, which we know varies positively with current income, plus this green distance here, which is independent of current income. And so this blue line, the difference between the blue line and the green line is just consumption demand. So then we can ask ourselves, well, what is the slope of this blue line? Well, the slope of the blue line is just going to be the change in demand over the change in current income. But we know that the change in demand induced by changes in current income is entirely due to consumption demand. So it's the change in consumption demand over the change in current income. And that's just this thing that we've called the marginal propensity to consume. So now what we want to do is combine the demand for goods today with the supply of goods today. And so we want to talk about how does the demand for goods today vary with the real interest rate? Well, it's going to vary for two reasons. One is a higher real interest rate makes current consumption more expensive. So what consumers are going to want to do is they're going to reduce their demand for consumption goods, but lower consumption is going to actually raise the marginal rate of substitution between current and future consumption. So that's a good thing because we have that the real interest rate is rising. And we know that the consumer's optimality condition is to set this marginal rate of substitution between current and future consumption equal to the real interest rate. So what's the second effect? The second effect is that a higher real interest rate raises the opportunity cost of investment. Therefore, investment demand is going to tend to fall. That makes the capital stock in the future lower, and that raises the marginal product of capital in the future. Well, that's a good thing too, because the firm's optimality condition is to set this net marginal product of capital equal to the real interest rate, and the real interest rate has gone up. So what we have now is two effects of a higher real interest rate. One is to make consumption demand lower, and the other is to make investment demand lower. So we get to this graph where here we have R1 is less than R2, so the real interest rate has gone up. Initially, at interest rate R1, the equilibrium is point A, where given this level of income, Y1, the demand for goods is YD1. The real interest rate goes up, that shifts this whole baby down, and the equilibrium moves to point B, which is where income level Y2 generates demand YD2. So we have that R1 is less than R2, but the demand under R1 is higher than the demand under R2. So we now have 2 points on the demand curve for output today, and here they are. R1, Y1, then a higher real interest rate reduces the demand for goods today, and therefore we get this downward sloping demand curve for goods today. So now we have a demand curve where the real interest rate is on this axis, output is on this axis. And if you remember, we also have a supply curve that has the interest rate on the vertical axis and output on the horizontal axis.